Welcome to Invisibly Unwell. I'm your host, Paige Lavelle. I've spent the past 2 decades climbing the corporate ladder. I've worked hard to get where I am professionally, but there's a side of me that few are aware of. I am also an autoimmune warrior, an eating disorder survivor, an author, and now a podcast host. My goal here is to educate and empower high-achieving women navigating autoimmune conditions and other chronic illnesses, who at the same time are also dealing with challenges that all high-achieving women face, like disordered eating, perfectionism, and people-pleasing. Invisibly Unwell is what I wish I had at the start of my journey. You are not alone. I hope my story and the stories and expertise of my guests will provide you with knowledge and ideas and empower you to share your own story and advocate for the life you've worked so hard to build. Quick disclaimer, this podcast is meant for general information purposes only and should not be taken as a substitute for medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Today's guest is Kaely McDevitt, a registered dietitian who specializes in women's health. She has over 10 years of experience helping clients reclaim their energy, optimize fertility, and overcome hormone symptoms through personalized nutrition. Having experienced the pitfalls of a conventional approach to women's health firsthand, Kaely is passionate about empowering women to build health from a place of connection to self, to nature, and to community. Kaely's light bulb moment came after 7 years of schooling in a health field when she realized she had been taught approximately 0 things about the way the female body worked. Because of this, in addition to her work inside her private practice, she also mentors fellow nutrition professionals inside her program, Leveraging Labs. I am so inspired by Kaely's story and what she's doing to really try to change the industry and what is available to those of us with chronic illness, especially high-achieving women. I know you will take away some very valuable lessons from this interview. Welcome, Kaely McDevitt. I really appreciate you, your willingness to come here and share your story and your expertise on Invisibly Unwell today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So I'd love to get started just by hearing a little bit about what it is you do and what got you there, and we'll dig in from there.
Sure. Yeah, so I'm a registered dietitian, but I specialize in women's health. So I run a virtual private practice where my team and I help women all over the United States really overcome longstanding hormone symptoms, optimize their fertility. Kind of under that umbrella is like thyroid and gut stuff, and really just feel home in their bodies again. So our sweet spot is like reproductive age females. So most of our clients are like 20 to mid 40s. And I found my way here through like personal necessity first. When I was in school to become a dietitian, my plan was to be a sports RD because I was an athlete at the time and kind of grew up an athlete and then had a brief stint of marathon running while I was in school. And as luck would have it, I had a whole bunch of hormone health issues while I was going through the schooling to get my RD. And it was really frustrating because I had these symptoms despite the fact that I was meticulously doing everything I was being taught in school correctly. I was doing all the quote unquote like healthy eating and healthy exercise and felt horrible. And so after all these years of schooling, I just realized how little I knew about the female body and the menstrual cycle and nutrition for women specifically. So I was spending all my free time trying to learn that information and really helped myself get back to feeling like me again and overcome a lot of those symptoms. And when I finally got there, I just realized how many other women in my life, like even in my immediate circle, needed that info. So really pivoted the career away from, sports nutrition to specifically nutrition for women's health because there's such little information on women specifically, and our physiology demands different inputs from a nutrition and lifestyle standpoint.
No, absolutely. I can say from my own experience, both in the autoimmune space and then in the women's health specific, especially being someone in that reproductive to later reproductive age, I'm 38 right now, it's been really eye-opening to me how little information there is in women's health. It's one of those things where you can step into a doctor's office and you assume they're going to give you exacts, right? Now, I've realized the older I've gotten and being through, or basically going through the experience I've had in chronic illness, there's a reason that anything in the medical field is called a practice, right? So it's science, you're constantly researching, you're constantly learning. But the amount of things that have been left with a descriptor of quote unquote mystery in a medical office in women's health has been very alarming and at times very frustrating, to be honest, for me. So I'd love to hear a little more. Just you talked about in your training how that was something that was a bit lacking, to put it mildly. How did you first discover that? If you could dive a little deeper into that, and where did you start to really do the research and fill in those gaps that you didn't quite fill in during your formal education?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I would imagine that the menstrual cycle was generally covered in like my anatomy and physiology classes in school. But what was really missing was connecting that to like the food and lifestyle recommendation aspect of my schooling. And a really interesting and alarming fact about nutrition research is almost none of it is done on women. In fact, really none of it until very recently was done on women, and we're just starting to get there. And so most of our nutrition recommendations are coming from studies that were done on men. And we have very different needs and very different physiologies. And one of the primary reasons why women were left out of that kind of research is because we're complex. We've got hormones that change every week. And there's so many variables there that it's a researcher's nightmare when we're trying to isolate things. So I was realizing that, I was somebody that understood the nutrition well. It was what I was going to school for, and I was applying it perfectly because, my background is being a perfectionist, like type A. If I'm going to do it, I'm going to do it and get a gold star, like that kind.
I can relate all too well.
Yeah, it's part of what got me here too. As far as symptoms go. But so I'm like, oh gosh, I'm doing all of this stuff and I'm not feeling any better. So there has to be a mismatch between this advice and how my body works and what it actually needs. And things were complicated by the fact that I was put on birth control really early, like in high school. Probably shortly after I ever really had a consistent cycle, I went on birth control to handle the symptoms I was dealing with. And so I also didn't understand how that worked. And that certainly wasn't part of any kind of curriculum. So my research and intrigue really started there. It was, how the heck does birth control work? What might the implications be for my health and nutrition needs? And then beyond that, how can I troubleshoot the symptoms that I went on birth control in the first place for in a way that uses food, lifestyle, maybe some supplementation versus a pharmaceutical? And that was really my entry point into it. And I had a complete awakening about the fact that the way I was eating and moving and living was at odds with the goals that I had for myself. And I could see this a lot in women trying to apply really nutrition and fitness research to no avail and just burning themselves out even further.
Absolutely. I have a two-part question. So the first question is around birth control and the impact that it has. For someone who was diagnosed at age 12, right on the cusp of 13, with my first autoimmune disease, I felt informed. Obviously, I was a bit naive. I was 12. I felt very informed with medications, with the patient-doctor experience. I was type A from birth, pretty much. So I felt like I'm doing all the reading. I'm doing what I'm told. This is in the late 90s, so I didn't have as much access. I think Google came around right around then, but I didn't have as much instant access at my fingertips. So I was doing research that was given to me, and I was asking questions as far as my intellect and maturity could, really come up with at that time. So I pretty much was raised to think that birth control was just a responsible decision. I was an athlete growing up. My cycle didn't start and wasn't really consistent till I was around 16, 17. I started birth control, I think, right before I turned 18. Yeah. And I was on it for well over a decade. So that is something that, at least to me, what was communicated was, this is a no-brainer. We're going to put you on a low dose. It'll make sure that you're safe. Obviously, I did not want to have children at age 18. I wanted to go to college. I had a lot of goals, and that's not something that was part of my life plan. And so I thought I was making a responsible decision. Now, I'm not knocking anyone for making that decision. Obviously, I did as well. But I'd love for you to expand a little bit upon what is not shared with us as women making that decision, because it's something that was really kind of revelatory for me when I learned about it years later when I finally stopped taking it.
Yeah, same. We have pretty similar stories, at least through high school years. And yeah, I too don't want to shame anybody that's made that decision. I made it too, was on it for a decade as well. And as a high school student that was having absolutely miserable, like missing days of school for my periods because they were so miserable, when that was presented as a solution for it, it was like absolutely a no-brainer. Easy. Let me get out of this particular discomfort. And it was being presented as like a cure-all for any hormone symptoms, and of course a responsible way to prevent an unwanted pregnancy. But what's not being explained is how it works and how that can impact different body systems. And so just like you, I had an awakening when I discovered these things years later and was kind of horrified that I didn't know this and I had been taking something for 10 years. So the main things of concern, in my opinion, with birth control, first and foremost, is that it is shutting off ovulation if we're talking about hormonal birth control. And that's how it's effective at preventing pregnancy, which is great. But we lose out on our own hormone production, which if we want to feel and function our best, I would argue that we feel and function our best with real estrogen and progesterone, not synthetic estrogen and progestins in birth control. For me, I had a lot of like anxiety and mood related symptoms on it, which makes sense given how those synthetic hormones work. I'm also concerned about the nutrient depletion from birth control. So we're using up a lot of nutrients that our liver uses to process the synthetic pill hormones. So we're looking at like B complex vitamins and a lot of our antioxidants, things like zinc and magnesium and selenium. And then another thing that is especially relevant to me with family history is the increased like tax on liver and gallbladder function while we take hormonal birth control. I've got some gallbladder cancer, which is pretty unusual in my family history. And it's actually in the package insert for hormonal birth control that it increases risk of gallstones and gallbladder issues. And we've since served a number of clients that have had, either gallbladder attacks or gallbladder removal since being on birth control. So that would have been something that I wish I knew. And then the last thing is that changes to the gut microbiome that it appear happens when we're exposed to that synthetic estrogen level. And we shift our microbiome to more of a gram-negative picture, which tends to be a bit more inflammatory. So when I looked at the symptoms that I was dealing with while I was in school, a lot of them matched up with how I would feel with some of those end effects of how birth control impacts the body. And what was frustrating for me is I was seeing a lot of different doctors. I was moving around a lot at the time, so it wasn't the same one. And I was presenting, I feel really anxious. I'm having heart palpitations. I don't feel like myself. I'm dealing with a lot of bloating and low energy. And it was like, well, you've been on birth control for 10 years, so that's not it. Or if you were going to have those problems, you would have had them at the beginning. So there was a lot of gaslighting initially with some of the realization about those symptoms.
Yeah, I could do an entire episode, which I should do, on medical gaslighting because we've been there. I find it really interesting that you spoke to selenium specifically. So I have Hashimoto's thyroiditis. I was not diagnosed with that and didn't really show symptoms till my early 20s. I would say late teens, early 20s. I was diagnosed at 24. Okay. And selenium is a very critical just vitamin that you have. It's a vitamin, correct? Mineral, apologies. Yeah. Mineral. Clearly, I work in fintech, and this is a very big passion project. So my goal here is to bring the experts on to continue to share the knowledge. So thank you for correcting me. So selenium, obviously, it's not a letter. There we go. It's been a long day. So selenium is a very critical mineral and something that I have to either supplement with taking Brazil nuts or eating Brazil nuts or taking supplementation. I'm very neurotic might be a bit of an extreme word, but I'm very careful about what brands I use and how it's sourced. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of regulation or scrutiny around what's out there supplementation-wise. So PSA, be very mindful of that. But selenium is something that impacts thyroid health. And as someone with Hashimoto's, I do find it interesting. I've never had it pointed out to me or discovered anywhere on my own that birth control, hormonal specific birth control, impacts your body's ability to absorb those types of nutrients. So that's a big takeaway for me. I'm definitely going to dig into that a bit more. What I'd really love to hear more about is you spoke to how your niche, basically your customer base, is that reproductive age, but with a focus on those type A high achieving women. And without asking you for free advice for myself, what where would you basically begin if you have a client and they fit that bill, which are most of the people that are listening to this podcast? What do you start to look at, and what do you kind of peel away to get to the root of some of the issues they may be experiencing and why they feel burnt out and why they're having a lot of similar issues that you experienced and that I've experienced in the past?
Yeah, this is my favorite topic because this was me. So I think you end up working with, like yourself 5+ years ago. That's like who the ideal client is, because you can empathize and you've been there. So I just want to first say, like, you're in good company if you feel called out by this, and there is another way. But the reason why I think the like high achieving type A, deriving our worth from what we do, like that whole personality type ends in health issues, and particularly hormone and fertility issues, is because it's a complete mismatch with our biological need for safety in order to manufacture hormones and be fertile. So one way that we like to explain this with clients is, in order for us to ovulate, so to have the chance of reproduction, our brain is always filtering how we're eating, moving, thinking, breathing through the lens of, am I safe or not? Do I have energy that is overflowing enough that I could support luxury functions in the body? Manufacturing hormones aren't necessary for us to exist, but they are necessary for us to thrive. And so we have to have excess energy to make that happen. And do we have excess energy to support a new life, if that's a goal? And your body is very smart. If there isn't enough energy around or enough safety, we're going to turn those dials down. We're either going to spend less resources on hormone production or actually shut the whole ovulation process off, because your body's looking out for you. It's looking out for number one. And if we don't have enough safety to keep you alive, we're certainly not going to add a new being into that mix too. And so if we think about it from a safety lens, then we want to look at things that are within our control that can create more safety in the body. And one of the first places that we start, just being nutrition professionals, is, are we eating enough consistently? If we skip that and we try to move on to fancier things, we very rarely make meaningful progress, because fundamentally that's the biggest signal of safety and energy availability, is consistent nourishment. And a lot of the like high achieving perfectionist women that we work with are under eating, either intentionally out of the goal to do health perfectly, or totally unintentionally because their life is just so busy and hectic and they've put themselves on the back burner. So we start first with that. Are we eating enough? Are we eating in consistent intervals so that the body knows and can expect that we have consistent nourishment coming in? If we accomplish that, our next place is to start looking at mineral status. Minerals are a big part of our nervous system flexibility, ability to buffer the stressors of day-to-day life, and even creating energy at the cellular level. And one pattern that is very clear in this type of clientele is a lot of mineral depletion from years of stress and burning the candle at both ends. And there's so much to unravel when it's a personality type of perfectionism, and that requires bandwidth to explore those questions and the capacity to think about how we might do it differently. And what I find is that if you're at the height of that like burnt out state, we're not at a place where we can even entertain that stuff. Like, we don't have the energy right now to deal with that. So if we can work on some minerals and eating enough first, we can create the energy in the body to create the bandwidth to have those discussions about, what does it look like to say no? What does it look like to create some boundaries around work? What does it look like to prioritize yourself and like put your own oxygen mask on first?
As a recovering perfectionist, every question that you just said is making me like come out of my skin. So anyone listening, it is very normal. And as you said at the beginning of what you were just sharing, you're in good company. It is not out of the ordinary for women, especially women in these really demanding careers and in a very hustle-minded, very male-dominated culture in the business world especially. Yeah. I'm sure you could shed more light on the medical world because I've never worked in that space. But those questions are unnerving because I don't know about you. I was not raised, nor was it reinforced around me to really advocate for myself or to set boundaries. And I have a great organization I work for. I have a great boss. I love my colleagues. I still get burned out and I still struggle to set boundaries.
Yeah.
So it's something that I really appreciate you talking about, the prioritization there. Because as a perfectionist, as a type A, as a please give me a gold star, I will do anything to collect another gold star on my chart. It is really difficult to not ask for the set of steps, A to Z, and want to execute on all of them at once. Because I have worked so hard and continue to work to stop the habit of just taking more and more and more on and piling the plate so high that it is impossible for me to execute on everything and follow things through. So I really appreciate that you specialize in the space for these types of women, like yourself and myself, where you have to take it slow. There's really no other option, because if you race ahead, you're not going to get better, because that's what got you here. So I really appreciate you breaking that down.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's the key thing, right? If we type A our way into the current health state, we can't type A our way out of it. And it sucks, because we are really good at that. Like that is our thing. That's our move. But
that's how we succeed everywhere else. So.
Yes. But it just doesn't work with health stuff. And I think that's what's been kind of a slippery slope in the more like functional and holistic health space is it gets out of control really quickly. All of a sudden you have like a 4-hour morning routine trying to do all the biohacking tools that everybody talks about. And then this desire to do all of it at once in order to do health perfectly. And that in and of itself prevents progress. So I'm glad that you brought that up. And I think, our mutual friend Dana speaks to this so well. It's why I love her so much, that like we just have to make this a lot less complicated and slow things way down.
I love that. It's a message that's hard to digest and process, but that makes complete and total sense. Yeah. I would love to hear your thoughts on, you first mentioned step 1, are we eating enough consistently? I can speak for myself here, put myself in the shoes of someone listening. I am not. Okay. I try to eat pretty consistently. I work from home, which allows a certain amount of flexibility. The downside for anyone who hasn't worked from home, there's almost no boundaries. Like you have to be very intentional with setting your time for meals, with setting your time for I'm not working yet. I'm going to be active in the morning. I'm going to have my coffee. I'm going to watch the news, or lately for my stress levels, not watch the news, just catch up when I can. And then when I'm done working, and I have the kind of job where sometimes that boundary gets blurred because something is a major issue and an escalation many levels above my head and I have to jump on the computer. So it has to be super intentional that I set that time to eat. And I've started to work on not meal planning, because I as a perfectionist, I can take that a little far, but kind of determining, okay, what do I have in the house? What is available to me to make? What should I make in advance? Just so that I have meals prepared and I'm not grazing and or frankly forgetting to eat until my stomach starts growling. I also have a history of disordered eating. I know they say in recovery, it's been a very long time since I've had an issue, but I would consider myself in recovery, but I survived it. And I have to be, because of that history, a little bit careful about anything that's too black and white, too restrictive, too, this is the way and there's no gray space. I'd love to hear your thoughts on how you would address, like I can use myself as an example, how would you address that first step of, are you eating enough consistently, when you know that's going to bring up a little bit of ickiness for some people?
Yeah, for sure. And that's a really common addition to the whole like perfectionism and high achieving type A stuff. And in those instances, like tracking food on a food log or things like that are really not appropriate, because it can be a really slippery slope and triggering event. So rather than like a formal tracking of food, I like to just be walked through a day in the life. What is your eyeballs open? What is the first thing that happens? And just kind of have a client walk me through the day in terms of what they're doing, what kinds of things they might eat, what the work schedule looks like. And it gives us a lot of insight into where there's opportunities for more support. So that's part 1 of, we got to get some eyes on what current nourishment looks like, because we can't guess. And then it's also about like the right metrics too. So how's energy throughout the day? Are we having 1 to 3 well-formed bowel movements each day? Do we have capacity to pursue interests and passions, or do we find we can just get through work and that's it? Do we wake up with an appetite, or do we feel like we're never that hungry? Do we ever get ravenously hungry throughout the day? Do we have a sex drive? Do we have regular cycles? There's a lot of other non-food related indicators of nourishment. Sleeping through the night would be another big one too. So if we're getting enough no's in those questions, we know there's some work to do on the nourishment piece. So we would go from there to asking a lot more about appetite. And waking with an appetite in the morning is a really good sign of metabolic health, but it's commonly not there when we first start working with clients. Either from long-term restriction where our body just kind of got quiet with the signaling because we've ignored it for so long, or we have so many stress hormones in our system because we open our eyeballs and we're immediately on email or the news or checking Slack that we're suppressing or blunting our hunger signals. So I really like to start with the morning first and then build the rest of the day from there. And that morning, ideal morning would look like a protein-rich, meaning like at 30 grams-ish of protein, breakfast within an hour of waking. And that really sets the tone for metabolic rate and blood sugar stability for the rest of the day. And I just find it a lot easier to snowball into more nourishing meals later if we start with breakfast versus, picking lunch or dinner to start with. And then we're just tracking those metrics. How are we feeling? How's that energy? Are we sleeping through the night? And the cool thing is that those types of symptoms change in pretty darn close to real time, whereas like lab markers and things like that they'd have a longer lag time, and it's free to check in on that. So I'm a big fan of specific metric tracking versus specific food tracking.
Yeah, I think that's wonderful advice. I've gone on and off with the tracking, just for if I'm trying to get in shape, and I've learned just with issues I've had over the years, and when I've gone very, very type A on the fitness and the nutrition front, I have learned I don't operate best with meal trackers. I like to occasionally use it just to kind of get an idea, like, am I eating enough? Am I tipped in one direction as far as macros? Whether or not anyone listening or you yourself, like whether or not you kind of believe in the breakdown of macros. Like I know for myself, like you said, starting with protein rich, I feel a little more nourished and I can get through a lot more calls if I have something with more protein in the morning. So I've done things briefly like tracking just to be like, am I getting enough protein? Am I just eating all, carbs? And carbs aren't evil, to be clear, but I love fruits and vegetables and those are great. But I'm like, I'm feeling kind of like I'm getting hungry again, or I'm not feeling like I can get through these, 1-2 hour working sessions. And then I'm like, oh, because I'm not eating any protein. So yes. I found that to be really helpful and insightful because it's really easy to just get into a routine and not realize that you might be missing out on something that could really help you.
Yeah.
So I appreciate you sharing those other ways of doing it without going straight to the tracking, because some of us can take that a little far. So I'd really love to hear more about when you spoke to your body basically focusing on itself. Like your body, priority A is the self and self-preservation, which makes complete sense. Nothing that I was ever taught, but it totally makes sense when you explain that from a biological perspective. So if someone is looking to have a family, this is something that I'll be very open. It's nothing I've shared on the podcast to date, but I wasn't sure for a long time, to be honest, if I wanted to have children or not. I was very career oriented. I went to school, went to grad school, continued to work. I worked through grad school. So it was something where I was really excited to live in different cities, to have different jobs, to have these experiences. And I just thought, maybe not. I don't know. Mm-hmm. So I met my husband, got married, and now we had the discussion beforehand of if we have a kid, great. If we don't, also great. We will travel, we will have a full life. And I know that not everyone has that feeling. I have friends who very much want to have a family. So there's always space for everyone, whether I don't want kids, whether you're open, whether that's something you absolutely want to pursue. I think there's a very wide spectrum there. One thing I never really looked into in advance was the impact that my hormones, my autoimmune conditions, my type A perfectionism, stress would have on that process. So I'd love to hear if someone came to you and said, we're trying to start a family and we're having some issues. Or if someone said, I just want to explore that. Because one thing that I've learned, which I felt a bit naive, I was very prepared to just not be able to get pregnant because I have multiple autoimmune conditions. I had an eating disorder when I was in my late teens to mid 20s. I knew that the odds were there might be a bit of an issue. What I wasn't prepared for was to get pregnant, no problem, but my body struggled to sustain a pregnancy.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until I've been through that I started researching, and it opened my eyes to just how common that is, especially with women who kind of fit this same demographic we're talking about. So if someone came to you, I'll use myself again as an example. Thank you. What would be where you would start? Like, where would that conversation start with that particular client?
First, I just want to say I'm really sorry that you've been through that. The fact that it's common doesn't make it any less painful, and it's just a challenging thing.
I appreciate that. I'll take a moment. It's hard, but now that I know just how common it is, I'm sharing because I really want anyone out there to know you are not alone. You don't only share this with people that you might know or someone say, like my friend so-and-so, it is so common. And I just want anyone listening to know, like, your experience is valid and a lot of other women have been through it. And I just think we all should be more open about it so that they understand that.
Agreed. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. And, I will say for you or for anyone that might be in the same boat with miscarriage or recurrent miscarriage, the first very positive thing is that we know that ovulation is happening because you've gotten pregnant. And that oftentimes is the first barrier to success here, is really inconsistent or absent ovulation, which would be a different starting point than this conversation. But if we know conception has happened, ovulation is happening, we haven't been sustaining that pregnancy, we've got a couple different things. On the side that's less under our control is the potential for like genetic abnormalities and the body doing exactly what it's supposed to do at that point and terminating a non-viable pregnancy. But there's a whole other list of things that would be in the realm of, do we have safety and energy resources? Because it requires a great deal of progesterone to maintain a pregnancy, and it requires extra thyroid hormone to maintain a pregnancy, because now we're creating energy for not only you, but development of a whole new being. And progesterone and thyroid stuff really go hand in hand. They've got a bi-directional relationship. The progesterone production is stimulating to the thyroid. Healthy thyroid function is stimulating to progesterone production. And both of those things are so heavily influenced by that safety conversation and the nourishment conversation of, do we have the raw materials to manufacture progesterone? Do we have the raw materials to make, convert, and uptake thyroid hormone at the cells? So those two places would be really interesting starting points of just getting some more data. What do our basal body temperatures look like? That's kind of on our free end of data collection. What is that waking temperature, like sublingual body temperature? What does that look like on a day-to-day basis? And specifically, are you
really quick
that?
side note, I'm glad you brought that up because it took till I was in my 20s to realize my basal temperature is lower than average. So there's been many times I've had issues and they've taken my temperature and said, you're fine, totally good, when in reality, I have a fever, something's going on. So that's something I don't think I've even talked about on here, but that is, you should be aware of that. If when you take your basal temp, it is not the standard that you read in a health book in 7th grade.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, I know. There's actually been some really alarming statistics about like human body temperature just declining in the recent decades. And I think that's a complete reflection of metabolic health declining. Your temperature is reflecting back to you the health of your thyroid and metabolic rate, because that's what creates warmth in the body. And if you're using fertility awareness method as a form of non-hormonal birth control or to plan for a family, that basal body temperature is one of the 3 metrics that you track, because it tells you if you ovulated or not and how strong that progesterone production is. Because in that second half of the cycle, progesterone hits the scene, stimulates the thyroid, and raises the body temp. So that is a really great, almost free tool. You just have to get a thermometer. And it's a great one to track throughout working on your health, because again, you can see that changing in real time, whereas you might not be getting blood work done on a weekly basis. It's not fun or cost effective to do that. But I would start with looking at basal body temps. I'd get a complete thyroid panel done if you've been having any miscarriages, meaning not just TSH, but the full thyroid panel that looks at antibodies to and free thyroid hormones, so free T3 and free T4, reverse T3. Go ahead. I didn't want to cut you off.
There's one thing that when I leave this world, I have spread the news about. It is to get a full thyroid panel, because I did not get diagnosed till my TSH was impacted. And I really, truly think I could have lived a much healthier life had I known that in advance. Now, everything works out. I have something I'm very passionate about in spreading that message, but I did not know until years after I was diagnosed that you should be testing for something in addition to TSH. So especially women out there, if you are experiencing symptoms indicative of a thyroid condition and you're just getting TSH tested, which is the standard, you do have the right to advocate to ask for the full thyroid panel, and it will give you much more information. So thank you so much for speaking to that. That is I will get on a soapbox anytime someone brings that up.
You and me both. It's really, really frustrating that we're giving women a very incomplete picture. TSH is the tip of the iceberg for thyroid function. And like you said and lived, there's a lot of room for interventions early on that can prevent damage to the thyroid. And I actually can't even begin to tell you how many women that have been diagnosed with unexplained infertility or have actually even gone through, IVF unsuccessfully, and they've never had a full thyroid panel done. It's like, in the scale of expensive things, IVF being one of the most expensive, full thyroid panel being like, depending on your insurance, $50 to $200, it's low level and it could catch a lot of things. And, I believe that there's a thyroid epidemic amongst women. And I think that mirrors the fertility crisis that seems to be growing too, because again, it all comes down to safety and energy. And we can't create safety or abundant energy until that thyroid is working really well.
So we talked about the steps if I were to come as a client, whether it's someone like myself who's experienced where I can get pregnant, that's not an issue or a hindrance. It's sustaining the pregnancy. And you would first look into progesterone, and then you would also look into thyroid function. And then where would we, assuming that we got that information, where would we go from there?
Yeah, so from a food perspective, our foundation, time and time again, will always be making sure that we're eating enough. And if there are opportunities for more nourishment in the day, that's where we'll start. That's our low-hanging fruit. So in your case, with a really busy schedule and a higher stress job, it's how can we create and protect meal breaks for you in the day where that's a priority? Because again, we can't really supplement or get fancier with things until that foundation is built on the nourishment piece. I would also be looking at the type of exercise that we're doing, type and amount. I think a lot of us type A'ers tend to use exercise as a stress relief and forget that it can be stressful too. I was running marathons in grad school and working and wondered why I didn't feel good.
Yeah, I was doing 5 HIIT workouts a week and going to grad school at night and working. And then I was like, why is my hair falling out? So yes, I understand. Yes.
While it feels good to do those types of workouts, because if you're in this camp of type A, we love the feeling of stress hormones in our system. That's what we know. That's our safe space. We feel alive. And that type of exercise can actually work against our efforts from a fertility standpoint, because again, we're adding stress where there's already abundant stress. So really being honest about, is the form of exercise that I'm choosing serving me, or is it moving me further from my goals? Where can I create more gentle movement? So a way that we like to do it, which we're not exercise specialists over here, so we don't prescribe it, but weights and walking are our favorite 2 modalities for women's health, because we get so many metabolic and hormone benefits from strength training, and we get metabolic benefits from walking without it being so taxing to the system. So if we're working on a fertility client and we want to bring controllable stressors down, exercise is one of those that we can look at. And then from there, we would start getting a little bit more specific from person to person. So within the context of progesterone and thyroid function, there's a number of different nutrients that would be helpful to look at to see where the kinks in the chain might be for the individual. And that's often very different from person to person. So that's where testing can be really helpful. One tool that we use with really every single client at this point is the hair tissue mineral analysis. So it's a hair sample telling us about 3 months of mineral status. And I hit on this before. about minerals being our buffer for stress, heavily used during stress. They create flexibility in our nervous system, and they are spark plugs for enzyme reactions in the cell. So if we are really depleted, as most burn the candle at both ends kind of women are, we don't have the raw materials to make energy. And you can actually have a totally normal looking thyroid panel, full thyroid panel, and still not be able to get that active T3 into the cells if our minerals are really out of balance. So it's nice to be able to look at that and find additional solutions above and beyond, manipulating medication dose, which I don't know if you've experienced this, but a lot of our clients have. They might change the dose of their medication, but they never actually feel better. And a lot of that is the not getting it to the cell.
Yes, as I'm sure anyone else listening who is a Hashimoto's patient, I have changed my dose more times than I can count. I've tried 4 different types of thyroid medications. I finally found something that seems to be stable. For me, it is a rather high dose, but as I said, it took so long to get diagnosed. I know there was significant damage done to my thyroid by my immune system, so it's something that can get very frustrating as you continue to up and up and up the dose, and either your blood work's not showing that it's improving, or your blood work shows it's improving, but you still feel the same. Mm-hmm. You still have that extreme fatigue. The brain fog is always very difficult, especially for us type A people when I'm an intelligent person, I'm a well-educated person, and I sit down to take a call and I forget basic words. Mm-hmm. That is a very real symptom with Hashimoto's. So that's something that I really appreciate you shedding light on. It's not something I think that is very well known, that just because you are ingesting a medication or a supplement does not mean your body is absorbing it the same way that someone else would.
Totally. So yeah, that's a big opportunity for creating better energy. And then the last couple of things I would add to that list would be things like sleep and circadian rhythm. Can we work on our sleep-wake cycles and our light exposure to be a bit more optimal? This whole biological mismatch between the go-getter, work really hard females and this fertility thing is also that we're humans living in captivity, basically. We're inside, we're in front of these computers all the time. If we're not in front of the computer, we're on the mini computer that's our phone, or the big one that's our TV, and overhead lighting, and just not seeing the sun or engaging with nature in a meaningful way. And I think that that's a really underlooked aspect of health, and regulating the system and creating safety is getting off of blue screens or using blue light blockers, which you are. I really should be at this point in the day. I don't know where mine got off to. And seeing the sun every day, particularly in the morning, is going to be the most potent for entraining that circadian rhythm. But even if it's in the middle of our day, can we step out during a lunch break and feel the sun on our face? Can we kick our shoes off for a second and be barefoot in the grass? Even just listening to birds chirping, which is relevant as we come into spring, is something that's really soothing for the nervous system and free. So I'd be thinking about stuff like that too.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually invested in a seasonal affective disorder, also known as SAD, a SAD light, because I moved to upstate Western New York, practically Canada. And we do have a few months where sunlight is pretty sparse. So if the sun comes out, we of course go for a walk and try to get outside. But sometimes you do have to do additional things to make sure that you have that type of light, because I definitely notice an impact to my energy level. My overall mental and emotional state is very impacted if I don't have that sunlight. I also grew up and spent most of my life in Texas. So it's a bit of an adjustment going from that to the Great Lakes region, where those clouds really hug the water. So if anyone listening can relate, can't recommend the SAD light enough. Not that expensive, definitely helps.
Yes.
But I also don't use it as an excuse to not go for walks. So even if the clouds are out, trying to get outside, even if it's cold, just put on a big jacket and do that walk, because just being inside and just being in front of screens, it took me till probably my mid-30s to really realize the impact that has. And then when I incorporate the things you just mentioned, it's almost instantly I notice a difference, and I can tell when I haven't done it enough. So I think that's great that you're spreading that information from someone who's an expert in the field of nutrition.
And I just really enjoy recommendations that are essentially free, and seasons do pose some challenges here depending on where you live. But like you mentioned, there are ways around this. We use light boxes with clients too that in the winter, or based on their latitude, aren't getting much sun exposure. I'm sure you're looking forward to this daylight savings happening and giving us some light at the end of the day.
I really cannot wait. We're over the hump here for sure, but there are times of year where my husband and I take vacation to places that are sunny.
Yeah.
Very fortunate that we have the ability to do that with our remote working situation. But it is, yeah, you do. You start to feel, it's not the cold as much, it's just the cloudiness and the dampness. So it's great to know that that's also something that you work with clients on if they have those limitations like I do as well.
Yeah. I think it's just like remembering that we're part of nature and we literally charge up in the presence of the sun with our feet on the ground or in some kind of water. There's a reason why we generally feel really good on a sunny vacation. Part of that is like a break from normal routines and often a break from work, but we're usually outside more. We're touching the ground, we're in the water, we're in the sun, and we're kind of like batteries in that way. And there's been so many funny memes about like everything is doom and gloom, and then I get 5 minutes of sunlight and I'm like, I believe in love,
Yeah, exactly. So spot on though. I'd love to hear a little bit about, I know that you obviously work directly with clients, and thank you for letting me be the client today. Yeah. I'm sure that it'll be very helpful for anyone listening who can relate to some of the health issues I've dealt with and continue to deal with. I know part of your work is also educating others within the medical field, since you did notice that there's such a gap in information around women's health. I'd love to hear a little bit about what motivated you to do that, how that's going. I think that's so critical because we can sit here and talk all day as women in that space, but it becomes a bit of a vacuum if there's not impact being made within the medical community itself.
Yeah. Thanks for asking about that. Definitely not something I ever intended to do either. That's just such as careers, I guess. They just unfold. But I was fortunate in actually my very first job as a dietitian. It was just a complete fluke, but I ended up working for a startup corporate wellness company when I was living in California that did functional lab testing for our corporate clients, which is probably the only time I've ever seen that being done. And what benefited me was that I was thrust into a job where I did like thousands of lab reviews just all the time and became obsessed with having additional tools to allow for personalized interventions, because I had already lived the fact that the my pyramid or my plate advice was making me feel worse, not better. And I wanted like what makes sense for me, because we're all different. And so when I eventually made my way into private practice years later, I had that lab experience. And so it was easy for me to navigate the logistics and bring that into practice. And I was getting a lot of messages from fellow dietitians being like, oh, we can do this. How do we do that? How do I set up an account? And then how do I get my clients a lab kit? And how do I handle all of this stuff? So I made a program called Leveraging Labs, I think 4 years ago now. And it was originally like, here's how you get set up with lab companies and here's how you make lab orders. And then it really blossomed from there over the last 4 years into like a 3-month exploration of not just testing, but how are we doing this in a way that really guides clients on their journey over a multi-month comprehensive program? And how are we doing this in a way that supports them as a whole being, not just getting so focused on individual markers, so that they see success now and they keep that success after. And so it's primarily other nutrition professionals that get drawn into that program, but we've had a handful of like RNs and PAs, and we have a doula this round, and a couple other types of professionals. We even had an acupuncturist, which was really cool. And it's created a really wonderful and supportive community of really heart-centered practitioners that are interested in like doing the detective work with their clients and not giving everybody the same recommendation.
Oh, that's wonderful to hear. Acupuncture is something that has helped me tremendously and that I continue to use in my toolbox, if you will, to treat the overarching chronic conditions. I've found there's so much out there that it takes a while to dig through, and you kind of have to find what works for you. And so I think it's really great that you're creating an environment where those people who really are seeking knowledge and want to find a way to like more holistically, that word gets thrown around a lot, but the true meaning of holistically, you're looking at a holistic level at everything that could impact a patient, especially in women's health, which I said, I would love for the word mystery to get moved out of those conversations that so often occur in offices, in medical offices, around anything that a woman is dealing with. Mm-hmm. So thank you for what you do. I think that's incredibly inspiring and will be very impactful. So I just want to thank you so much for being here today. I know that what you're sharing, it's certainly taught me a lot that I'm going to take away. And I know that it'll be just so informative, and it'll make a lot of people listening feel like they've just taken a deep breath and feel very seen and very heard. So thank you for sharing everything that you're doing.
Thank you. It was my pleasure, and just really enjoyed it.
Yeah. If anyone listening would like to read more about your work, potentially work with you, learn more about the practice, where can they find you?
So you can find me primarily on Instagram. It's at Kaely RD. My name is spelled weird. It's Kaely RD. And then my website is the same, KaelyRD.com. But in both places, you'll find a lot of free education and then info on how my team and I can help you in a couple different capacities if you need it.
Thanks so much, Kaely.
Thank you.
I really hope you enjoyed this episode of Invisibly Unwell. If you like the show, I'd greatly appreciate if you followed it, and if you left a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever it is that you're listening. This allows me to keep the show going and to continue to bring on incredible guests to share their stories.